Shalom. First and foremost, call Halal Yamla, Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai, Ba'ashem HaRachakwadash. Double honors to the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone that I learned this truth from. And also peace and salutations to the hopeful elect of the nation of Israel, scattered throughout the four corners of the earth. And pretty much in this video, I'm going to be going into an article, as you see here on the screen. This is from the peoplesvoice.tv. And as you see the title of the article, Trump executive order will force Americans to surrender biometric data or lose their bank accounts. All right. And as it goes into, it says, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has confirmed that a Trump administration executive order requiring U.S. banks to verify citizenship for every customer, new and existing, is actively in progress. All right, and mind you, okay, these executive orders that we see being, passed around, okay, and put in place. All right, these executive orders that we see going around, from this Trump administration, all right, and so on, are what the scriptures calls unrighteous decrees. Okay, let's get that in Isaiah 10. Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 1, which, this is going into the ancient Assyrians, all right, who, took down the northern tribes. But here in these times, America, Babylon the Great, is the modern day Assyrian. All right. It says, Isaiah chapter 10, verse 1, woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed. Okay. Because before Esau, Edom, does all these things and does all these acts, all right, throughout America and throughout the earth, okay, he has these things prescribed, all right, which the word prescribed literally means right before, pre meaning before, and then scribe means right, all right, via what? Unrighteous decrees, executive orders, okay, wicked policies, all right, wicked bills and things being passed. All to what? Verse 2, to turn aside the needy from judgment and to take away the rights from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey and that they may rob the fatherless. Not only does this, this system, this Americanized, westernized system, all right, pass forth unrighteous decrees that they prescribe to take away the rights from our people, of course, Israelites, so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, but ultimately all these executive orders and unrighteous decrees are ultimately aimed at taking away all the rights of all these so-called American people when it's all said and done, okay, for the purpose of control, right, put more hell upon people, all right, and, further, accelerating this place, America, Babylon the Great, into the NWO agenda, all right. And so going back, it says, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has confirmed that a Trump administration executive order requiring U.S. banks to verify citizenship for every customer, new and existing, is actively in progress. In process. It says the policy means millions of Americans will have no choice but to obtain and present a U.S. passport containing embedded biometric facial data, or risk being locked out of the banking system. All right. So as it just went into, okay, in the near future, U.S. citizens are gonna have to, possess a U.S. passport. All right, and as I said, with embedded biometric facial data, within it, programmed within it, or else basically people won't have access to their bank accounts. Okay, they won't be able to check their money. All right, deposit in money or take in money, get a loan. Okay, unless they have a passport that includes, okay, facial data, biometric facial data, which biometric, okay, when you look it up, bio means body and metric means measure. All right. So people, here in the United States, Babylon the Great, in the near future, are going to have to possess something, all right, that measures their body via facial data, okay, via U.S. passport, in order to basically have access to their own bank accounts, all right, their own money, so to speak. Which we know ultimately the money of this system doesn't belong to the people, okay, because it's ultimately fake money. The Federal Reserve note, okay, and it's ultimately a debt note. That's why, okay, your so-called dollar, right, is made out of the same made out of the same material as a birth certificate, which are all instruments of debt, basically. Okay, DEBT, debt. Because pretty much when you're born into this American system, you're automatically born into debt. Okay, social and you're born a slave. Hence why you have a birth certificate, which is nothing but a debt note. Okay, you have a social security number, which basically shows that within this system, you're not even recognized as a human being. You're just another number in the system. Just like prison. When you're in prison, okay, you're not known as a human being by your so-called name. All right, the name that your parents gave you or whatnot. You're ultimately just known as a number within that system, the prison system. Okay, and all throughout your life, you're going around spending what? Federal Reserve notes, which is ultimately what? A debt note. You see that? Because what? Again, when you're born into this American system, you're ultimately born a slave, and you're by default born into debt. You see that? And we know Esau Edom, via his top banking families, they ultimately want to crash this old system, right, and bring forth, slavery on a whole nother level. Hence why, Trump, when he was rubbing elbows with those technocrats within the first 2 or 3 days of his, after his inauguration in January 2025, when he launched the launch of Project Stargate, the $500 billion Stargate project, one of the main phrases that was made when you watch that, pretty much that conference, at the announcement of Project Stargate, was basically Trump and those technocrats that he rubbed elbows with said what? That they basically want to bring back the golden age of America. Now, when you think about the so-called golden age of the United States, that basically took place when? Okay, when they had our forefathers in slavery. All right, chattel slavery, working in the fields, picking cotton. All right, raping our women, buck breaking the men. All right, stealing land from Gad and Reuben and Issachar. Right, the Trail of Tears, genocide. Okay, those were the real so-called golden years of America. Okay, when they had our forefathers in hardcore slavery. So the fact that you have Trump and his administration with the launch of Project Stargate beginning in January 2025, saying that they basically want to bring back the golden age of America, that means what? They ultimately want to bring back slavery, but slavery on a whole nother level. Technologically, digitally, right? Via pseudoscience and AI and technocracy, right? And as this article continues to say, it says Besant, so like I'm gonna read this again. This part again. It says the policy means millions of Americans will have no choice but to obtain and present a U.S. passport containing embedded biometric facial data, or risk being locked out of the banking system entirely. All right. It says Besant made the remarks last week at a semaphore dinner in the CNBC Invest in America forum. He argued banks must fully, quote, know your customer, including legal immigration status, and declared that undocumented immigrants, quote, don't have a right to be in the banking system. So another, as you see, one of the other main narratives that Esau, Edom, and his elites are pushing, okay, to go forward with linking people's passports and facial data with their bank accounts, is they're pushing the whole issue of this immigration issue that's been plaguing America over the past 4 or 5 years or so on. Okay, and and of course it's all orchestrated by the elites of Esau Edom, because they use the Biden administration to bring in all these migrants. Okay, which were when you watch the Esau mainstream news media over these past 4 or 5 years, of course the main faces that Esau has made, okay, in regards to the whole migrant situation is our people, okay, the northern tribes, Issachar, Zebulon, Asher, Ephraim, okay, as well as Levi thrown into the mix of it, the so-called Haitians, okay. So when most people in this country, America, think of immigrants or migrants and whatnot, okay, they mainly think about Jake, okay, the tribes, the northern tribes, Haiti, okay. But mind you, as well, what they don't talk about in the media as well is that not only have you been seeing an influx of northern tribes and migrants coming into the country by droves, but also as well fighting age Chinese men, okay, so-called East Indian Elam, okay, so-called Arabs, right, and as well even so-called so-called white migrants, South Africans and whatnot, okay, Ukrainians, all right, which the media doesn't talk about the so-called migrants coming from those countries, right? But they only want to paint Jake as the face of immigration and illegal immigration and all these things, right? And over this past year, that's got a lot of these MAGA Edomites in uproar over thinking that America's turning too brown, and the so-called white man, woman, and child in America is pretty much getting wiped out due to immigration and the fact that Edomites are repopulating less, and different nations of color are coming over here in droves and having babies and populating too much. And so what's one of the so-called solutions that the elites are getting ready to come with to say fight this so-called immigration issue that that they orchestrated in the first place? Because this is all problem, reaction, solution at the end of the day. They create the problem, in this case the so-called immigration problem. They sit back and watch the reaction from these people, especially the Edomite American, the red-blooded patriotic MAGA American, and then soon they're getting ready to come with their so-called solution to this immigrant problem, which is what the brothers, starting with the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone, on down to least of us that are of the hopeful elect, have been speaking on for these past few years, that this so-called solution that the elites of Esau Edom are getting ready to come with to combat the so-called migrant situation is some form of digital ID, biometric system. And lo and behold, look at what we see right here. Okay. Let's see. And it says, again, I'm going to read this part again. Bessent made the remarks last week at a Semaphore dinner and the CNBC Invest in America forum. He argued banks must fully know your customer, including legal immigration status, and declared that undocumented immigrants, don't have a right to be in the banking system. See that? So they're going to use this whole, biometric facial data, link with people's passport system. Okay. They're pushing a narrative that this is going to be used to fight, undocumented immigrants and illegal immigrants and all these things. Okay, but really, we see, what the real agenda of it is all about. Okay, locking people out of their bank accounts and locking people out of the system if they don't submit to this biometric decree. Okay, because, well, matter of fact, let me read this. It says, reports indicate the order would accept passports as the primary proof of citizenship, while real IDs and many other common documents that Americans have traditionally use to prove their identity do not qualify. See that? So you know, in these upcoming months, weeks, and whatnot, okay, the only thing that Americans are going to be able to use, all right, in the upcoming near future, within the next months, weeks, and so on and so forth, is going to be people having to provide passports in order to prove their citizenship. Because as it went into the old way of people proving their citizenship won't qualify in the near future. Okay, and mind you, most people here in America don't have passports. Okay, many can't afford it, right? So therefore, what? Many people here in this country resort to proving their citizenship by what? State IDs, driver's license, birth certificates. Okay, and and the fact that this system is moving toward a system where these things will no longer be able to be qualified to prove a person's citizenship. All right, because even as a matter of fact, a few months ago you had this chick Kristi Noem, all right, the former head of the DHS appointed by Trump, right? When he got back in office, there was articles going around a few months ago, as the whole controversy with ICE was heavy in the news back a few months ago. There was a reports from various news outlets and websites and whatnot, or even Kristi Noem at a few months ago at that time when she was the head of the DHS. Okay, pretty much came out and said that pretty much Americans, American citizens will no longer be able to prove their citizenship with birth certificates no more. Standard ways of how people in this country prove their citizenship via state IDs, driver's license, birth certificates. Okay, mind you, this is all being done. Okay, what we're looking at right here, as you have ICE agents ramping up more and more throughout the country, and I believe right now they have over an $80 billion budget. Okay, which is a higher budget than the U.S. Marines. Okay, and not to mention that they're buying up all these warehouses throughout the country, which the mainstream news media is not talking about whatsoever. Okay, and we ultimately know why they're buying up all these warehouses, because they ultimately turn them into detention centers, concentration camps, okay, prisons, as Yahushua spoke of in the book of Revelation, the 2nd chapter, 2 and 10. Okay, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, right? And so, while that is going on, okay, you also have this going on, all right? And mind you as well, this is all as well taking place in the midst of the controversy going on between the war with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, you look on the news one day, Trump is saying the Strait of Hormuz is open. Okay, the next day there's reports saying that the Strait of Hormuz is closed down. Okay, there's back and forth going on in that region, right? You don't know what the hell is going on. There's all kind of market manipulation going on, okay, concerning that whole Strait of Hormuz situation. And meanwhile, behind all the back and forth and all the controversy, okay, this technocracy, okay, this digital system is still being rolled out, okay, via this Trump administration. You see that? And it says again, I'll read this part right here again. Reports indicate the order would accept passports as the primary proof of citizenship, while real IDs and many other common documents that Americans have, such as birth certificates, state IDs, driver's license, have traditionally used to prove their identity, do not qualify. See that? So if these things that Americans traditionally use to prove their citizenship will no longer qualify in the near future, then you got to ask yourself, well, exactly what will qualify for Americans, legal American citizens, to prove their citizenship? Because in this article, it's going into passports. Okay, people having to obtain passports to access their bank accounts and things like that. Okay, but ultimately, it's going to go further than that, because passports can be stolen. passports can be taken from people. So therefore, what? There's gonna have to be an even more upgraded, advanced system to how people in this country are going to be able to prove their citizenship and have access to their bank accounts. All right, we all know what it's all going to eventually lead to. Okay, things like what we're looking at right here in this article. Okay, is just one more gradual step that's all going to lead to Revelation 13 verse 16. Okay, as a matter of fact, let's start up at verse 14. Revelation 13 verse 14. It says, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles. Okay, because Esau Edom on the left hand side is getting ready to come with miracles. All right, through the power of Satan. As it speaks of in 2 Thessalonians 2nd chapter, with all power, signs, and lying wonders, doing the working of Satan. Okay, pseudoscience, pseudo technology, counterfeit power. Okay, and it says, Revelation 13 verse 14 again, and deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by a sword and did live. Okay, and ultimately, the beast that was wounded by the sword but did live is talking about, the ancient Western Roman Empire, all right, which was wounded back around 476 AD. Okay, and then 1,000 years later, during the 1400s, we know Esau Edom came out of the caves of Europe, out of the caves of the Caucasus Mountains, to kickstart off, what was known as during the 1400s as the Renaissance period, right? Which Renaissance, when you look it up, means rebirth. Okay, and when you further go into the, what was the purpose of the Renaissance period? It was all about ultimately bringing back, ancient Greco-Roman values and ideas and customs and culture into the earth. Okay, ancient Greco-Roman ways. All right, and if we know one thing that was common about ancient Greece and ancient Rome back in ancient times was that those were both empires that was ruled by Esau Edom, the biblical Edomites, the so-called white man. All right, and pretty much from the Renaissance period up to 1400s up until now, of course you had the Spanish Empire. Christopher Columbus came out of that empire, right? Came over to the side of the world in 1492. And pretty much began to slaughter and grape rob and murder amongst the northern tribes that were already on the side of the earth, right? And then later on you had the French. The French came into power during the late 1700s, going into the early 1800s. All right, and then later on you had the British came into power, the British Empire, right? Which also went throughout the earth. Okay, going as far as countries like India. All right, and even China, doing what they do best, coming down with a sword, grape robbing and murdering, colonizing, right? And then eventually it all led to America, Babylon the Great being a superpower of the earth. Okay, which America declared its independence back in 1776. All right, and then later on in history, America eventually took the reign as a dominant power of the earth. After World War II, when they dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki during World War II. Okay, that pretty much marked the beginning of America's dominance as a global power. You see that? To ultimately, through America, okay, through this American system, it ultimately, fully brought back the ancient Western Roman system, okay, with America basically being the new Rome, okay, and NATO and EU being the modern day vassal states of America, okay, just as ancient Rome had vassal states out of Europe, okay, the Anglos, the Franks, the Visigoths, right, different Germanic nations, okay, the Gauls, the Vandals, and so on and so forth. Well, those are basically the ancient names of the countries that are a part of NATO and the EU, all right, that aid in America's dominance. Which, of course, we see in these latter days, America, along with NATO and the EU, is being divided up more and more. Okay, over Greenland, and of course over this war with Iran. Okay, and it's going to further lead to more division within this beast system. Okay, leading to America being destroyed. But we know before America gets destroyed and before the missiles pop off, okay, one of the major prophecies that has to come to pass is, as we're reading right here in Revelation 13 and continuing on to verse 15, it says, "And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak." Okay, and how is the image of Rome, all right, speaking through America, NATO, and EU? Through Roman architecture, all right, all across America. The Senate, okay, the Constitution, all right. In school, you learn about Roman numerals, right? Various terms within Esau's law system is in Latin, which was Latin, the official language of ancient Rome. Okay, you see various uh uh you see various things within this westernized, Americanized system that models ancient Rome as well as ancient Greece. Okay, because this is the revival of ancient Rome. Okay, this is how this American westernized system is how Rome is living all over again. Okay, Revelation 13 verse 15 again, and it says, "And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak, and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed." Okay, and America is further accelerating the image and the ways of Rome throughout the earth. Okay, via what this NWO agenda that the elites of Esau Edom are looking to establish in the near future. All right, so much as what, as it went into that as many that would not worship the image of the system. Okay, the ancient Greco-Roman ways. Okay, the wicked satanic vibration that's within the system. Okay, if you don't accept alphabets, if you don't accept feminism, if you don't accept AI, right? If you don't accept the technocracy that's coming down the pipe, and ultimately, if you don't accept Esau's NWO agenda via pseudoscience, AI, technocracy, that what, as it said, should be killed. All right, and when you go into this word "killed" in Revelation 13, verse 15, all right, we know it goes into to be physically put to death, carnally put to death, sent back to the spirit world, unalived, right? But then when you go right here to the root word, okay, Strong's G575, apo, and it means what? Of separation, okay, of local separation. Says in the definition B, of separation of a part from the whole, where of a whole some part is taken. Definition C, it says, of any kind of separation of one thing from another, by which the union or fellowship of the two is destroyed. Yeah, so basically, any and everybody that's within this American westernized system, okay, that's not gonna bow the knee and conform to this NWO agenda, all right, and as well in this case, anybody within this American system that's gonna refuse to to conform to this biometric facial data system, linked with the passport, okay, they won't be able to access their bank accounts, okay, they won't be able to access their so-called hard-earned money, right? Because again, this is all one more gradual step towards what we're reading here in Revelation 13 verse 15. Okay, this is all leading to the NWO agenda. Okay, that as many as would not bow the knee to this NWO agenda should be killed. All right, whether it be cut off from society, not being able to access their bank accounts, not being able to work. Okay, or eventually we know that Esau is going to come with draconian measures to physically, literally unalive people that's going to refuse to accept and conform to his NWO agenda, right? And then as well, of course, what's going to be the ultimate thing that people are going to have to do, okay, to showcase that they're down with this NWO agenda. Verse 16, Revelation 13, verse 16. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. See that? And of course, as we always go into this word mark, all right? Strong's G 5480, charakma, and it means a stamp, an imprinted mark, okay, of the mark stamped on the forehead or the right hand, okay, not on the forehead or the right hand, but rather in the forehead or the right hand, meaning what is going to be physically inserted inside of people's right hand or their foreheads, all right, not on it, but as it says, as a badge of the followers of the anti-Messiah, which we know there's no one single anti-Messiah on the earth, or that's going to pop up on the earth in a lot of days is going to, take over the world and spread forth wickedness and evil. No, because ultimately, when you read about the concept of the anti-Messiah or anti-Christ in the scriptures, okay, which is only found in the book of First John, all right, ultimately the anti-Messiah is a spirit, okay, it's a spirit, which is the scripture says in First John that there's many anti-Messiahs throughout the earth, all right, in this beast system, America, NATO, and the EU, that's forwarding the NWO agenda is anti-Messiah, all right, anti-Yahweh Shemal Shai. See that? So if you take the charagma, the mark of the beast, okay, you're pretty much going to mark yourself as a follower or a slave of this anti-Messiah, anti-Yahweh Shemal Shai NWO agenda. All right, then it says definition B, the mark branded upon horses. Now in ancient times, and even today in these modern times, why do farmers and agriculturalists who raise animals, raise cattle, why do they mark or brand their cattle or their horses? Okay, for the purpose of ownership. You see that? To let people know, okay, who that cattle or who that horse belongs to via what? A mark or a brand, a stigma. You see that? And then it goes into thing carved, sculpture, graven work of idolatrous image. All right, showing you what? That the MOTB is meant to be something physical. Okay, a physical object that's going to be put inside of people's right hands or their foreheads. Okay, and of course, we, the hopeful elect, starting with the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone, down to the least of us that of the hopeful elect, can clearly see that the MOTB, all right, is the microchip, all right, the microchip. Okay, that's going to be the object that's going to fulfill all these things that we're reading of right here. Okay, an R to the F to the I to the D, microchip. Okay, and that's ultimately, as we went into in this article, okay, people's biometric facial data linked with the passport. This is just another gradual step that's all going to lead to the MOTB, the microchip. Okay, because again, things like passports and physical forms of identification, things like that can be stolen or lost. So eventually, as people are going to find ways to get around this, the passports and things like that. Okay, and issues are going to occur from people having to obtain passports to prove their ID. That's when we know Esau is going to eventually come out with a more advanced, more sophisticated way of forcing people to prove their ID and allow people to access their bank accounts and buy and sell and do different things. There's also going to be people having to take the microchip, okay, the MOTB. You see that? And this is just one more step that's going to eventually lead to that. You see? And when we go to the root word of this word charagma, it says Strong's G 5482, charaks, and it means pale or stake, a palisade. All right, and it says Strong's definition says to sharpen to a point through the idea of scratching. See that? So showing you that the MOTB has to be something physical, and it is something physical. Okay, something that's going to be inserted inside of people's right hands or their foreheads via something sharp and pointy. Okay, syringe, right? That's going to be the tool that's going to be used, okay, to implant the microchip inside of people's bodies. Okay, a syringe, the Koroks, as we're looking at right here, right? And then even when you go into this, the root word of this word Koroks, all right, Strong's G 1125, it says grapho, and it means what? To write with reference to the form of letters. Let's jump down. It says right here, to commit to writings, things not to be forgotten, write down, record. Okay, record. All right, then it even says in definition D right here, it says to write to one, i.e., by writing in a written epistle to give information, directions. Okay, so this word grapho also goes into information. Okay, records. All right, because just like your passport can contain certain records about you, who you are, what your name is, social security number, all right, your bank account information, okay, where you live at and things like that. Well, guess what? It's all going to eventually lead to the microchip, the MOTB, okay, which is also going to contain, records of who you really are, your social security number, okay, your birth certificate information, which state you live in, all right, your bank account information, medical records and medical history, all right. This is all what it's going to lead to. Is it's starting off with passports and facial recognition, okay, but it's all going to eventually lead to the microchip, MOTB. You see, and let's read right here. It says the biometric trap. It says every U.S. passport issued since 2007 is a biometric e-passport. It says it contains an RFID chip that stores your personal data along with a digital facial image specifically formatted for government facial recognition systems. All right. Although applying only requires a standard photo, that photo becomes permanent biometric data held by the State Department. It says by tying bank accounts to passport verification, the executive order transforms this biometric passport into a de facto national ID requirement for financial survival. All right. It says tens of millions of Americans without a valid passport will now be forced to get one. Okay. And you got to consider, what about the millions of Americans who may not be able to afford a passport? So how will they have access to their bank accounts knowing that they can't afford a passport? Okay, well eventually it's all going to lead to them, to them having to take the MOTB, the microchip. You see, and it says handing over their facial biometrics to the government in process. All right, and eventually this is going to lead to them handing over their foreheads or their right hands. Okay, it says this is not voluntary. It is compulsory access to your most personal biological identifier just to hold a checking or savings account. All right. And we know it's going to be more than just, for people accessing their checkings or their saving in a savings account. It's ultimately going to be for the purpose of control. Okay. Because that's, the ultimate goal of Esau's NWO agenda. Okay. Total control over people, animals, creation itself, in life itself. Okay, for Esau to ultimately play God on the earth. You see? And so hey, this is where we're at in prophecy. Okay, this is all leading to, what our forefather John the Revelator saw in the book of Revelation, the 13th chapter. You see that? So any Israelite out there that's still thinking that, all this advancement in technology, okay, that we see going on around us, cashless payments and digital payments and digital systems and biometric systems and all these things. Okay, for any Israelite that's looking at all these things, okay, that's still not linking it to prophecy and still not, speaking on it and ultimately linking everything that we're seeing to what John the Revelator saw in the book of Revelation, the 13th chapter, then hey, you just not a man of the Lord. Okay, the Lord is not dealing with you. Okay, point blank, period. Okay, because clearly the scripture speaks about how the men of the Lord will be watchmen, meaning what? Seeing all these things and seeing all these wicked agendas by Esau and the heathen nations, and warning our people against it. Okay, warning our people of things to come, and as well being able to tell through the Spirit where all this is gonna eventually lead to. You see that, and that's only being done by the true men of the Lord. Okay, those of us that are of the hopeful elect, starting with the apostles, the bishops, and the elders of Great Millstone, down to the least of us is of the hopeful elect. You see that, and so when it's all said and done, okay, those of our people that's going to conform and bow the knee, okay, Israelites included. Hey, the scripture says in the book of Isaiah, all right, Isaiah, because these things are no longer conspiracy theories. Okay, now they're conspiracy facts. All right, they literally, these things are literally coming to pass right before our eyes. All right, and it clearly links to nowhere other than what our forefather John the Revelator saw in the book of Revelation, the 13th chapter. Okay, and this is the book of Isaiah. It's like the book of Isaiah, chapter 36, in verse 6. It says, "Lo, thou trustest in the staff of this broken reed on Egypt." Okay, and we can tie this today to America, as America is the modern day Egypt and Sodom, pursuant to Revelation 11, verse 8. It says, "Lo, thou trustest in the staff of this broken reed on Egypt, whereon if a man lean, it will go into his hand, and pierce it. So is Pharaoh king of Egypt to all that trust in him." See that? And Esau, Edom is the modern day Pharaoh over this modern day Egypt, America. See that? And those of our people, the 2/3 of our people, that's going to conform, bow the knee, right, to this NWO agenda, and take the charagma, the microsia, as it said, where if a man lean, it will go into his hand and pierce it. Okay, and in their right hands or in their foreheads, to ultimately be marked for destruction and judgment by Yahweh Shema Shai, via fire and brimstone, as it speaks of, all right, about the judgment that's going to come upon the 2/3 of our people that take the MOTB. Okay, they should be destroyed with fire and brimstone, which is ultimately what? The nuclear missiles, in the presence of the Lamb and the holy angels, as it says in Revelation the 14th chapter. You see that? And if even those of our people that know that they're Israelites, okay, walking around with fringes everywhere, okay, not warning against all this technology that we see, not speaking on the MOTB, not speaking on the microchip, okay, telling you you think God cares if you put a microchip inside your body. You're damn right Yahweh Shema Shai cares if we put Esau's madness and these heathens' madness inside of our body, because it's all idols at the end of the day, as we went into in that word charagma in Revelation 13 verse 16. You're damn right Yahweh Shema Shai cares what we put in our bodies. Okay, why do you think we have a dietary law? Okay, so if the Lord cares about what foods, for example, we put in our bodies, then how much more us putting idols inside of our bodies via the MOTB, the microchip. You see that? And that's why we, the hopeful elect, the men of the Lord, are standing so boldly and stiffly warning our people against this system and against all this technology, and heavily warning our people not to take the MOTB when they're faced with it. Okay, because if you take it, you're going to be marked with destruction. You see that? Point blank, period. So you can pretty much read the rest of this article on your own. All right, and if you need, Lord willing, I'll put a link in the comment board or the description box, upon request. But yeah, this is where we at in prophecy, and this is where, these are the times that we're coming into down the pipe. That's why the scripture speaks about the just shall live by faith. Because very soon as Esau, Edom is steadily coming down with his his NWO agenda via pseudoscience technology, linking everybody on the central, global digital grid via AI and the MOTB. And we, the hopeful elect, it's going to come a point where we're going to have to detach from the system, okay, and lean and step out on faith fully to Yahweh Shemal Shai to endure to the end, to live to see Yahweh Shai when he returns and take down his wicked, demonic, NWO agenda that Esau Edom is looking to roll out. You see that? So so with that, Lord willing, this video was edifying, and until next time, Shalom.